minute because folks are still joining, and then we'll begin. Folks are still joining, but I think we are ready to start now. So over to Chris Armstrong from Armstrong Process Group. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much, Birgit. Well, let's dive on in. Today's topic in our series on building an architecture platform is around effective architecture decision making. And just a little bit about APG. Ultimately, we're here to help organizations align their IT and systems engineering capabilities with business strategy using proven practical approaches. We do a lot of participation in industry standards as it relates to providing ideas on how to advance standards at places like such as the Object Management Group around things like the Unified Modeling Language, the Systems Modeling Language, and many other modeling specifications. We're also very active at the Open Group in the Architecture Forum that produces and governs TOGAF, as well as other areas of interest, particularly IT for IT and Archimate, and we're also committers to the Eclipse Process Framework project at the Eclipse Foundation, and we're partners with a number of tool vendors, including Sparx, Hewlett-Packard, and IBM. So, the objectives for today's session are to, really get to the root of, what is an architecture decision? Why do we need to care about them? Are there criteria and kinds of architecture decisions that, that can help us guide on what things actually demand the rigor of an architecture decision? When do we make architecture decisions throughout various enterprise architecture or solution delivery life cycles? Who makes those decisions? What information do we need to gather to support good decision making? Is there a particular approach we take for documenting those decisions and communicating those decisions to the rest of the enterprise? So, the first webinar in this series around building an architecture platform, kind of laid out what we call the enterprise architecture value chain, and certainly can defer you to the recording of that webinar on the AEA website if you're interested in more details. But ultimately, when we take a big step back and think about what we do as architects at multiple levels of abstraction, we were able to distill this into basically a four-step process that as architects we're trying to, provide the organization some intelligence around understanding what's going on and where they want to go, be able to provide a set of analysis services based on that content and then make decisions on that, and then ultimately respond with a call to action to actually change the architecture or maintain the architecture. And the context for this is just to make sure that we, at least in the context of this work we're doing at the Open Group in the EA Capability Improvement Project, that as you probably wouldn't be surprised, architecture decision making is a capability that we've placed underneath architecture planning that's a part of the decide step of the value chain. So we're going to, be taking a look at a number of bodies of knowledge. What I'm most impressed by, and I'm sure many of you folks out in the real world, stumble across, problems that need to be solved in your organization. Wonder if anyone has thought about trying to solve those, and go out to the world's greatest architecture repository, google.com, and it's very interesting what you might find. And so there's three things. One of them in the footnote here, and I've got a set of references in the back for detailed follow-up, is a industry standard from ISO called 4210, or 42010-2011. This was formerly known as IEEE 1471, and this is a standard that focuses on architecture descriptions. But one of the nice additions that was made in the most recent version a couple years ago was the inclusion of architecture decisions. So we're going to kind of start off with that standard as the basis for some basic definition and context. So according to 4210, an architecture decision is, a conscious design decision that may concern the system as a whole or one or more of its elements. We consider these to be significant because they're often related to how well the system is going to meet, in particular, its non-functional requirements or quality attributes. And the reason it's a part of this standard, again, is that it should be reflected in the architecture descriptions that we create. or ADs as that is used throughout the spec. And so just one thing, not to, I'll try to keep it clear throughout the presentation, but in 4210, AD is used to describe architecture descriptions, but in the context of what we're talking about, AD may also be a part of, be used to characterize an architecture decision. And again, the whole point of that standard, and again, we've done some talk on that in other venues, is providing guidance on why and how we should build models that describe architecture based on stakeholders' concerns to help us understand a set of views we need to render out of models from a different set of viewpoints. But again, one of the new things that was added is the notion that building models that address stakeholder views and all that sort of stuff is really good, but a really rigorous, comprehensive architecture description should also include architecture decisions and rationale. So, the architecture descriptions, the architecture decisions may require the existence of specific elements within our architecture descriptions, or they may change the properties of certain elements within our architectures. And in many cases, should trigger some sort of trade-off analysis that helps us understand, again, the pros and the cons of any particular approach and what the side effects of those things might be to the architecture that we're trying to synthesize. And again, this is architecture either at the enterprise architecture level or different levels that TOGAF describes, like segment or capability, or a lot of this stuff is very applicable at the solution delivery project level as well. And one of the things that 4210 provides is some guidance on what kinds of circumstances might we find ourselves in that we should consider, executing an architecture decision process. So those decisions that are in relationship to architecturally significant requirements, and there's a good body of knowledge from the Software Engineering Institute on ASRs and how to collect those and review those with stakeholders. Again, in many cases, those architecturally significant requirements have to do with quality attributes, things like the performance, reliability, scalability, modifiability, extensibility of the architecture we're putting together for a particular solution. Decisions that need or may require a significant amount of investment of effort or time to either decide, implement, or enforce. Decisions that have a broad expanse of stakeholders that are impacted by the consequence of that decision, particularly if there are side effects. Decisions that are involved that perhaps are indicative of some architectural novelty, where we have the solution and the approach to it isn't necessarily terribly obvious, or we're going to have to do more rigorous investigation. Decisions that are, sensitive to changes, either in our business environment or our technology environment. Decisions based on the choice we make to implement them are going to be costly to change. And, one of the things that a very rigorous method called the architecture trade-off analysis method suggests is actually creating what are called architecture change cases that help us describe what are the circumstances under which we expect the architecture to change and what's their certainty and likelihood. Decisions that end up resulting in affecting the project delivery model, particularly as it relates to the work breakdown structure, or different quality attributes that need to be measured at different parts of the life cycle, and decisions that result in significant capital expenditures. So this is one of the call-outs, is that, within your organization, you could use, 4210 as a starting point, but the idea is that having some criteria that the organization understands helps filter all the decisions that need to be made throughout the enterprise, which ones of them are architecture decisions that, again, require the attention of the architecture community. 4210 also has a number of conceptual data models included in it. Again, if you want to find out more about the bigger picture architecture descriptions, there's lots of good stuff in there. But here's a snippet of that standard that has to do with the architecture decisions themselves. And the nice thing about it is that it puts them in context with the architecture description itself. Namely, humans are constructing and contriving a approach towards synthesizing and describing an architecture for a particular set of stakeholders, and that description should include a set of rationale. And this is based on, one of the things I observe as an architect, working over the course of my professional development and with clients today, is that, a new architect, when they come into an organization, is usually filled with bewilderment and wonder about how come things are like the way they are. And, at the end of the day, they are because they are. But, in the context of all the best practices we can put in place and the tooling we can put in place and processes and whatnot, I really think elevating architecture decisions is one of the most simplest, not necessarily easy, but simplest things to institute within an organization, because it really helps capture, what I think is really organic tribal knowledge within most organizations. Namely, a new architect comes on to the team, and usually after, 3 to 6 months, because of conversations with other architects and peers and systems owners and so on and so forth, people get a sense of, oh, that's why you did that. Okay, I thought that might have been the case. But, trying to elevate the capturing and exploitation of those decisions that were made in the past is a great way to orient new architects very rapidly. And it also helps the enterprise, maintain intelligence by itself, in the sense that, just because you made a decision at a certain point in time does not mean that that is a good decision forever. So it's good to, again, be able to have a record of those decisions, so that when circumstances change, you have some additional rationale on perhaps why a new decision should be arrived at for a particular topic. So the idea is that an architecture description should contain a set of rationale, but the rationale shouldn't be all by themselves. They should be connected to a set of architecture decisions as the justification for why things were put together the way they were. An architecture decision should or could be traced to an element of the architecture description. And so this is another call out, that being able to inject and integrate architecture decision recording into the models you build can be very powerful, because imagine being able to pick a particular component within your architectural model, and related to it is a bunch of architecture decisions that describe why that component was built the way it was and assembled from what other existing components, so on and so forth. So that's can be a nice way to, again, connect the architecture decisions to the work that people are doing in those modeling tools, and I'll show you some examples of that a little bit later. Of course, architecture decisions are ultimately trying to address a particular stakeholder concern, and depending on the nature of the decision and its side effects, may raise additional system concerns. And lastly, of course, architecture decisions are very rarely made in isolation, namely by virtue of making a certain decision, it has a dependency on other decisions that are going to be possibly made or have been made. And that's, again, for complex systems, keeping track of all the decisions and the interdependencies between them, again, is a great way to really rigorously manage the evolution of the architecture landscape. And when we take a look at another body of knowledge, I'll describe a taxonomy that a particular author suggested for the different kinds of relationships that we might be interested amongst multiple architecture decisions. And a key part, as you saw from the conceptual model of 4210, is the idea behind a rationale. So, there's different levels of maturity of decision making, and we'll take a look at that as well at the end of this presentation. So, obviously, or maybe not obviously, this will be, I'm very curious as it relates to some of the poll questions that are coming up, like, do you do architecture decision making in your organization? Is that decisions are made, whether they're known to be architecture decisions and that they actually are things that have been decided upon. So we find, early on in an organization's voyage, these decisions are made implicitly by the organization as a whole. I mean, certainly there might be some predilection to the architect, but, someone has to make a decision about how to approach this problem or solve this particular technical issue. So decisions are made, but capturing a rationale really is the justification and the rationale amongst all the possibilities that we could have chosen from, why did you pick this one now for this particular context? So again, provides that basis for justifying the decision and the reasoning behind it. One of the best practices in architecture decision making is the fact that there should be 2 or more alternatives that are considered, because one of the things to think about is it can be very difficult to prove that a particular decision is the best decision or a good decision, because every choice, particularly these significant architectural things, always has trade-offs. You know, one thing goes really well when you implement this thing from a certain approach, but it has side effects that perhaps aren't desirable, but you're trying to weight all those in the context of a number of possible alternatives. Now, of course, we also want to limit the number of alternatives. We don't want to just go on a rabbit hunt looking for every possible way of solving a problem, particularly if there are best practices and standards that already exist within our organization. And so within the 4210 specification, it talks about some requirements for architecture descriptions, that architecture description shall include rationale for each decision considered to be a key architecture decision, and the architecture description should provide evidence for the consideration of alternatives and the rationale for the choices that were actually made. And another great body of work is by Philippe Cruchten, who's been a major contributor to the architecture profession for the past many decades. He wrote a really great, brief, but to the point and very succinct white paper about the ontologies of architecture design decisions. And one of the things that he suggested was coming up with a taxonomy of what kinds of decisions are likely to be made. And this can be very helpful, as we'll see a little bit later in the context of a decision-making framework, identifying the kinds of decisions that architects and stakeholders regularly find themselves facing. And this is another part of the maturity evolution is, a lot of times the identification of things that might be architecture decisions is a little more ad hoc. It's left to individuals' discretion. But this taxonomy, perhaps could provide a way to inspire people to think very broadly and diversely about the things that they're deciding. And then eventually, as maturity improves, potentially elevate this into what another author talks about that I'll be showing you guys in a sec, the idea of having guidance models about certain types of technology problems, particularly with certain technology platforms or architecture styles. Because as we get more and more experience working within a particular architectural style, we should be aggregating best practices, often in the context of reference architectures. And those reference architectures should describe the kind of a decision tree that says, well, the first thing you need to think about is, what reference architecture you're going to use, and then what technology platform. And then there's, again, an interdependency between the decisions that every project has to make, and having guidance to end users to help with that can be a great, wonderful thing. So in Cruchten's work, he talked about there being 4 fundamental types of, or actually 3 primary types with 1 subtype, that he gave interesting Latin names to. So one of them he called antichrises, the idea of that there are decisions that have to be made about the existence of things, and either those are design time or structural decisions that have to do with how the architecture is put together, or behavioral things that have to do with how it operates in real time. And then he gave a special name to bands of existence, which are called antichrises, which is a statement that says you cannot use this, or you cannot approach this problem this way. Then there's another set of decisions called property decisions, which he classified as perichrises, that either are constraints, that they're, the choices that are available to you are limited. There are some rules that you have to follow, or there's some best practices and guidelines that you should embrace. And then there are executive decisions that are in some cases arbitrary but important to make, that have to do with organization, structure, and relationship, the processes that we're going to be using, the technologies and tooling that we're going to use. And in the same white paper, Krusten describes a possible life cycle for each architecture decision. And so this starts bringing up, particularly when you're trying to elevate the maturity of architecture decision making, some of the complexity that, the idea that an architecture decision is identified as an idea, in the sense that I think we need to make this decision. Then people say, yep, I think you're right, we need to make that decision, so it would then transition to the tentative state. But of course, it might be possible, as you'll see from a couple of different places, that the decision is obsolete, that, hey, at the time you brought it up or at the time the decision was made, it made a lot of good sense, but now it doesn't make any sense anymore. The happy path is once it's been tentatively approved or, brought into the work stream, then we actually make the decision that, yes, we are going to do it like this, but it's possible, that decision could be rejected. And then after it's being decided, it finally gets approved to a first-class decision that then possibly could be the basis for enforcement and compliant for this project and other projects in the future. But, this state machine leaves the possibility out there, again, just because a decision was made at one point in time doesn't mean that it's a good decision forever, or maybe we didn't have as much information as we do now. So it allows for decisions to be challenged, which requires them to go back to the decide state, which could eventually, again, cause them to go back to rejected or obsolete. And so this gets into, particularly when you think about tooling, not only do we want to keep track of the statuses of each architecture decision, but it would be great to have some workflow that really facilitated the movement of these decisions through this life cycle. And then the third major body of work, and this is really significant if you really want to get into some really hardcore, rigorous engineering and a lot of very in-depth reflections and case studies, is the work of Olaf Zimmermann, where he did a lot of this work at IBM Zurich a number of years ago, and I think he's now gone commercial working with ABB, if I'm not mistaken. But he has just a significant amount of content in what he calls the SOA decision framework, where there's basically three fundamental phases of the framework, namely, how do we identify things that require architecture decisions? And that would be including identifying the problems that people are commonly facing. So again, particularly if we can build that into a reusable guidance model, or at individual project, you just, the architect and the project principals get together and just think about what are the things we have to figure out. Do some description of that in some way by creating a description of the decisions and how it affects the architecture. Gather a set of possible solutions that we would consider to be alternatives, and then that provides the backdrop for us to now actually make a decision. So once we have some alternatives, we evaluate those alternatives, and there are a number of different methods for doing that. Again, ATAM, the Architecture Trade-Off Analysis Method from the SEI, is a very rigorous large-scale process for that for very complex systems. There's a lightweight and agile version of that called QAW, Quality Attribute Workshops. Then there is decision analysis and resolution processes that are a part of the CMMI from the SEI as well. So there's a lot of good information on alternative evaluation. And then based on a set of criteria, you choose one of those alternatives, and that actually results in, the decision that was made, which Zimmermann calls the outcome. And then we need to get into the enforcement part of the life cycle. I'd probably choose a little more gentler language, because one of the things we need to think about is how does this all work, for example, in agile software development shops, which is unfortunately not something I have particular content on, but I think it would be a good ongoing discussion. But certainly, once a decision has been made, and this is one of the, again, reasons for wanting to document them, is that there's no reason for 500 other projects in the same organization to be faced with the same decision and have to go through this process all over again. Again, just because a particular decision was made a certain way for a certain project doesn't mean that it is appropriate for everybody. But if a project went through this process and then, described the problem, gathered some alternatives, did evaluation, and chose one, that provides a great possible level of reuse for another project that's trying to face the same problem. Again, they may not make the same decision, but at least we could prime the pump with what the decision is and what some of the alternatives were considered to be. And so, you know, getting that information out to the enterprise so that it can be readily accessible by all project architects and other stakeholders is an important thing to think about. And then ultimately, certain decisions may end up becoming decisions that are adopted as a part of reference architectures and standard ways of working, and so that may get into some, you know, compliance control aspects of the life cycle as well. But, you know, one of the things that we need to take a step back, you know, because, and I don't think, you know, Zimmerman and his team are implying this in the framework you saw on the earlier slide, is it's just not quite as simple as that linear process in the sense that we need to make architecture decisions throughout the entirety of the life cycle of development, whether, again, it's enterprise architecture development or solution development. And so, you know, quoting something from Khrushchev's paper that he attributes to Herbert Simon, who is a Nobel Prize laureate in economics and artificial intelligence and other diverse fields at Carnegie Mellon University, says, you know, a characteristic of design that's special to it that makes it design, you know, besides the, you know, the incremental emergence of exactly what our goals are and what we're trying to achieve, is generating alternatives. And there's a lot of theories around how we can do decision making, and there's a great body of work by statisticians and economists in that regard. But, you know, a lot of his observation is that, you know, most theories of decision making start out that there are a given set of alternatives, and then you're asked to choose amongst them. But in practice, when we're doing design, most of the time is spent in actually figuring out what the alternatives are, which aren't necessarily obvious. And the idea that we're going to, you know, start out understanding all of our decisions and all the possible alternatives at the beginning is very unrealistic. So we really need to inject the idea that we need to be, you know, looking at the decisions that need to be made, the alternatives that are available, and particularly as it relates to technology, obviously, right? I mean, you know, the way the pace of technology is changing today, a decision you made yesterday may no longer be valid today just because of new standards or new products or disruptive technology that are coming out there. So we really got to keep our eye on this on a regular basis. But one of the nice things that Zimmerman does in his, again, SOAD decision modeling framework, which he pulls together an acronym called SOAD, and again, there's a bunch of references about this as he's evolved this over the past 10+ years, is that there's an underlying Metamodel for the decision-making framework, but that there's two fundamental chunks of it that relate to how we operationalize it. And one of them being, you know, probably that's most important and relevant to start with, which would be the decision model, namely the decisions that actual projects need to make on the ground when they're doing solution delivery. So we need to know what the issues are, you know, ones that have been, you know, open to resolve. What are the drivers that are affecting the way we are approaching the problem and the selection of the appropriate alternative? What are the pros and cons of the different alternatives that are out there? Are any of them currently being used within our enterprise, and do we have any experience to gather about those? And then what was the actual decision that was made, which alternative was chosen, and what was the justification for that decision? And so, you know, I really think architecture decision-making needs to start there at the project level, but because we want to make sure that we don't over-formalize this too quickly, because that's a great way to kill anything, is, you know, let's focus on getting project architects at the solution delivery level, understanding that they're expected to make architecture decisions, and there's some basic information and metadata they should be thinking about when they do that. And if we can get them to actually write down what the decision was, that would be a great victory. And then if maybe in round 2 we can get them to document the alternatives and the rationale, that would be even better. And then, finally being able to make those decisions available to the enterprise so that other architects can exploit, that investment would be even more awesome. And a lot of those are, I think, really prerequisites to being able to scale up to what Zimmerman talks in about his guidance model, which is really a set of reusable assets to say, hey, and as you might not be surprised, his focus is in SOA, is that, when we build a SOA application, not to say that there aren't, changes in technologies and paradigms, but, we've been doing it for a while, and, those of us that have had experience, building those kind of solutions, we know what the decisions that need to be made. We may have some preferences on what the alternatives are best that may be based on our experience with certain technologies or lack of comfort with unknown technologies. But, when we go in to try to solve a problem, let's try to, grow up a little bit and say, hey, we as architects, we do have an understanding of the kinds of problems we're likely going to be asked to solve. And a guidance model can help, again, prime that pump after you've harvested the experiences from the project to package those together, in many cases, in the context of reference architecture. So, hey, here's a SOA reference architecture. Here's the different pieces of it, how they're supposed to go together, patterns that are related to it, and, again, architecture decisions that were made that resulted in this reference architecture. So if you agree to use it, you may be held conformant to those requirements, as well as the kinds of additional, more lower-level implementation detailed decisions that may need to be made based on particular choices in the reference architecture. So there's a lot of synergy between the two, but again, caution people to scale up too quickly with the guidance model before they're prepared to really manage some of that. And in some of his additional content, he provides a nice little picture of, in the case of components and layering, the general architectural decisions that need to be made, no matter how we're solving the problem. So, one of them being, what's the overall organizational approach of our layers? Are we doing, an MVC architecture, an N-tiered architecture, a blackboard architecture? When we have different layers communicating and interacting with one another, do we understand how we're going to, provision requests to use those services? Are there specific best practices and specifications for defining the signatures of the behaviors that we expose through those interfaces? Do we understand the qualities of service that this layer of the architecture is expected to respond to? Do we know how we manage access control to components in this layer? How do we manage the life cycle at runtime of these individual components? How do we do logging? So I would imagine many of these are topics that you guys are asked to solve on a regular basis, again, irrespective of the technology platform. And then, once we get into a particular layer, what is the structure of that layer? And how are different components within that layer going to interact with one another? How are they hosted? How do we do state session management? How do we do error handling? And so this would be an example of the kinds of things that, again, we might expect to see in a conceptual reference architecture as a part, again, of an overall guidance model to help inform people about the kinds of decisions that are going to need to be made and if there are any preferences based on standards and past experience. And then moving on to some additional examples from Zimmerman, here's an example of an actual architecture decision. One of the things, this isn't a formal model, as you probably wouldn't be surprised, but it's a nice, simple kind of PowerPointy way to do it, that this is a decision that affects the component model. It's, again, the service and component layer pattern issue. So, basically the question is how should we organize the service and component layer? And this is, again, based on having made another selection previously, which you'll see on the left, of the reference architecture. So whatever reference architecture you picked now has led you to this particular question. Provide some guidance on, resources you might want to take a look at to get educated on some of the different approaches. So here are, Martin Fowler's Patterns of Application Architecture, or Frank Bushman's POSA book, or the Gang of Four Design Patterns might be a good place to start. And that there are 4 alternatives. Interestingly, a little typo here that 2 of them are entitled 2. We can do the traditional, patterns based on these bodies of knowledge. We could do domain-driven design patterns. We could use the core J2EE patterns or other pattern languages. And there's, again, some recommendations on, the organization's disposition towards the kind of decision they'd like a project to make. This is a macro decision architecture, or a macro design decision that should be done by the application architect, and the outcome of it is going to be related to, or is going to affect the component model, and it's going to be related to some other architecture decisions that need to be made as it relates to adopting patterns in this particular case. And in the context of TOGAF and its set of federated enterprise repositories, it's important just to, contextualize that what we're talking about here goes into what TOGAF calls the governance log, and a special section within that called the decision log. And this, again, is a part of the architecture repository. And what might not be obvious from this, but maybe from from experience, is that the decisions that are tracked here have to do with the content that's everywhere else in the repository. So it may have to do with the standards that we've chosen. It may have to do with the reference architectures we've synthesized, the templates we've created for architecture standard work, descriptions of our architecture landscape, the products that we've selected to be a part of our solutions repository, so on and so forth. And one of the things that I'm hoping for out of a future version of TOGAF, and of course we're making some of these contributions in the architecture forum, is a little bit more depth on architecture decisions. So there is an acknowledgement within TOGAF that architecture decision making is important, but there isn't a lot of meat to, I think, provide clear guidance to the end user community. So obviously, we're going to be proposing incorporating, at least by reference, some of the best practices that we're talking about here. And what we've done in some of the work that we've been doing with clients recently is putting together a conceptual data model or Metamodel of what exactly is the kind of information we need to keep track of about architecture decisions, so that when we think about doing this in a modeling tool or in a repository, we have a good idea of again, the pieces of data and their relationships. So, and this is kind of an aggregation of the things that we've found both through experience, working with a number of clients, what 4210 says about architecture decisions and rationale, what Zimmerman's SOAD framework talks about, as well as Krushton. So it's kind of hopefully a useful integration of those different viewpoints. So we've got a number of attributes, again, about the decision itself. One thing being is that, let's make sure we uniquely identify decisions. We've given this decision a name. We understand the problem we're trying to solve. Are there any parts of it that are out of scope? And then, what's the scope's context? Does this have to do with the application that we're building? Is it more of a time-related decision, or is it related to organizational context? What kind of decision is it as it relates to Krushton's taxonomy of an existence, non-existence, property, or executive decision? What was the rationale that was used to pick a particular alternative? And so that's the idea that an architecture decision should have 2 or more alternatives that have names, pros and cons, and then which one of those was the one that was actually selected, and then based on having selected that alternative as the decision, are there required actions that need to be taken? What are the assumptions that were made or considered when making the decision? What was the motivation and context for the decision? What are the consequences or implications of the decision? And then something that Zimmerman actually goes to great depth in some of his recent work is an idea of an explicit taxonomy for architecture decisions, and he calls those kind of meta decisions, those things that we frequently encounter, again, all the time, like what process are we going to use, what tool are we going to use, what layering scheme we're going to use. And then he actually goes further and talks about a specific set of meta decisions for service-oriented architecture. So that would be a part of helping to categorize the decisions so that they could be easily retrieved if this stuff were to be put into some sort of repository. Of course, want to keep track of the status of the decision. We want to understand which project, and even though it's the multiplicity here is specified to be one, that really should be probably clarified to say the decision is made because of a specific project. However, the decision that was made may affect other projects and may be adopted by other projects. So having that, PPM asset intersection would be really useful, particularly if we can tie the decision to an explicit architectural element, an actual application component in our repository, or a service description, or a business function, or a technology product. And of course, if we can relate that to other content, including models and views that we're building in our modeling tools, would be a great, wonderful thing. But then a couple other call-outs here is one of the big things that people overlook is the context for the guidance that should be applied in making architecture decisions should come from your architecture principles. So as many of you may know, that's one of the things TOGAF recommends you put in place during the preliminary phase. And those architecture principles, we often see they become really stale. They're posters that show up on, in the cubicles of the architects and all that good stuff. But when you look at how relevant those principles are to day-to-day activities, you sometimes get a little suspicious. So I think it's really important that you validate and legitimize your architectural principles when you make architecture decisions, because one of the things you can get out of that is evidence that the principles you've adopted are affecting behavior and decision-making. And so this would be a simple way to get some basic metrics out of a repository, and also help the governing bodies and other executive stakeholders assess whether the principles you have in place are actually resulting in the right types of decisions and behaviors, and should those principles be evolved over time. But then the other thing I wanted to call out is the related architecture decisions. This comes out of, again, Krushton's work, that there's a lot of complexity amongst architecture decisions. So one decision might constrain another type of decision. Namely, it may remove a particular choice that's available. A certain architecture decision may forbid a different architecture decision from being made, or it enables it, or it subsumes or overrides it. Or there are certainly cases, and as I'm sure are in all organizations, you look across the landscape and you see conflicting decisions. That is, different decisions were made amongst the different alternatives, and now the organization has acquired technical debt because of that potentially unnecessary complexity. Or architecture decisions may be hierarchically decomposed into more finer-grained decisions, or a decision is bound to another decision or is an alternative to another decision. So again, if we've got a repository of all the decisions, then it would be possible for someone to go ahead and fully or continue to articulate the context of those decisions as it relates to a number of other decisions. So let's kind of wrap up by going through and taking a look at some examples of how people keep track of decisions. One of the most simplest ways, and I don't want to, diminish the importance of being able to achieve this step in your architecture practice, is just writing the architecture decisions down. So this is, very common, typical entry-level way to do it, but I'm still surprised in 2015 how many large-scale organizations that have architect communities don't actually do this. And I would, to be quite honest, of all the things that I would want an architect to document, it would be the architecture decisions. Again, we're big fans of modeling and reference architectures and repositories and all that good stuff, but it can take, a novice or someone who's, unskilled with those tools. It can be a real big drain on an organization to get them to do that stuff, and it can require non-trivial investment in the tooling itself. So you know, if an architect has one thing that one responsibility and deliverable they have, it should be, here are the decisions that need to be made, here are the alternatives that we considered, and here are the decisions that were made considering those alternatives. You know, that's enough work for an architect to, you know, rigorously document. And again, I think it's the most key essential aspects of, you know, an architectural deliverable, where all the other stuff would be, you know, great, nice to have supplemental stuff. So, you know, here we have a great example of, you know, the architecture decisions that were made, some very, you know, very simple template for capturing the metadata about a decision. So, you know, what is the issue or the problem, the alternatives, and this is where I'd probably, you know, raise, you know, a flag that alternatives were none. I think there are always alternatives because it's pretty darn hard to justify a choice if you didn't think about it another way. But of course, one alternative is not changing anything or not doing anything. You know, what's the decision? What's the justification for making that decision? What assumptions were made or were brought into the decision-making process? The motivation for this decision, and then are there any particular implications? But then there are, you know, some higher order ways to do this. And the next couple slides I'll show you are some excerpts of some tools that, to be quite honest, I'm not sure if they're still around in 2015. This came out of some work that was done predominantly at IBM back in 2007, 2009 era. And prior to this webinar, I went out to try to see if I could find where these could be downloaded, and I didn't run into a lot of success. But so whether or not these things are available for you guys today may be one question. I think they're at least demonstrative of some of the approaches people have taken for tooling. So this is a product called the Architect's Workbench, and as you probably would guess by looking at it, it's an Eclipse tool, and you can kind of get a sense, for example, on the left-hand side, what the taxonomy is. So, you know, there's a set of global executive decisions and information management decisions and process and service decisions. And here are, you know, listed in that tree view, you know, 8 executive decisions. And here we're looking at a specific one, platform and language preferences, where, you know, we've got, you know, a short description of the problem that we're trying to address, a statement of that. Again, similar attributes that we saw in the Metamodel of motivation, recommendations, alternatives, and the outcomes and justifications. Then there's another prototype that was built by Nancy Schuster, I believe, when she was doing her thesis work in Germany. And there's, again, an explicit reference for this at the end, where she created a design specification based on a set of requirements, in many ways it looks like based heavily on Zimmerman's work, who she worked with, called AD Quick, which is basically a architecture decision wiki. And there was at one time the ability to download this as a, you know, basically a WebSphere application from IBM AlphaWorks. But like I said, when I looked for it this morning, I didn't find any notion that it was still up there. But again, it just is another way of describing the kinds of information we might want to keep track of. So again, what's the scope of this decision? What's the problem statement? What are some of the drivers? What are some of the different alternatives? You can see those in the little list box, and then information about each alternative. What's our general recommendation, and some possible alternatives depending on requirements. How we're going to enforce this, and what, you know, relationships this has with other architectural decisions and references to come to better informed about the topic material. What I was able to find as in a more recent thing, at least from an IBM perspective, is in Rational Software Architect version 9 and above, there's a new feature called the Architecture Decision Knowledge Toolkit, or ADK, and this, you know, brings the ability to model architecture decisions into the modeling environment. So here we just see an example, and this is based on work by Ramaswamy in the Agile Architecture and Design work he's doing in the ALM community. at Developer Works that says, well, you know, one of the things we got to figure out is how we're going to migrate from Eclipse 3.6 to Eclipse 4.2 for our RSX products. And the decision that was made, well, was we're going to adopt the object constraint language version 4.0. But that's related to another issue about is 4.0 aligned with UML 2.2? It's related to you know, how we're going to be able to do JUnit testing for OCL-based constraints, how we're going to create an editor for the tests, the drivers being, you know, how are we going to deal with, you know, 3.0 compliance of OCL when we're trying to move towards 4.0, and, you know, the particular solution that was chosen in this particular case, you know, let's package those old OCL packages with our new deployment. And then one of the ways that, you know, we've been using it, and this is actually an APG, based on an APG development project that was a small team. And so we were, you know, trying to do this in the context of an agile process. And so this is, I think, a reflection of really trying to be as minimalistic as possible, but also exploiting, you know, the capabilities of a modeling tool and environment where, you know, we needed to make some key decisions, and part of this had to do with some inexperience of the major principals, namely me. I had not been involved in some of this development stuff for a while, and, you know, was familiar with the options, but just didn't have the answers from the top of my head. So it seemed to me we need to make some decisions about a database server, which we classified as a architecture mechanism. So that's often, again, an element of a reference model that's described in a reference architecture. You know, we could use various flavors of a SQL Server for that because we kind of made a other architecture decision that we didn't document, ironically, that we were going to do this on a Microsoft platform. Then we needed to make decisions about data access protocol. Are we going to use OData, do a REST API, or just create web services? How are we going to deal with persistence? You know, are we going to do, you know, custom hand-coded SQL? Are we going to use a, you know, object relational mapping mechanism? And if we're going to do that, are we going to use the ASP.NET Entity Framework or, you know, Hibernate? And then what, you know, approach are we going to take for the web user interface? We're going to do traditional MVC, web forms, light switch, or maybe take a more interactive, you know, approach with HTML5, AJAX, and jQuery. And so this was a real simple way for us to document the important issues that we needed to decide, the different alternatives that we were considering, and then the other elements on here are actually hyperlinks to articles online that we were going to be using as the basis for getting informed. So this is kind of that reference content. And this was done in the context of a very simple UML profile we created for Sparx Enterprise Architect, where we, again, can, you know, stereotype these things as actual architecture decisions and have a couple of very fundamental attributes about, again, complexity, rationale, risk, and status. So we rejected SQL Server 2014 because it was not supported by Enterprise Architect version 11 at the time. And one of the things that I think there's a poll question coming up, we're rapidly running out of time here real quick, about architecture maturity. So I don't know if people have time to, you know, I'm not going to read them necessarily for you. Is based on, you know, there being potentially 5 different levels of maturity in the architecture value chain and capability model. Here's what we've defined at the EA Capability Project for identifying the different levels of maturity for architecture decision making. And so I'll give you guys like 5 more seconds to make a choice, and then I'll move on. All right, here we go. So in conclusion, you know, we just want to make sure that everyone understands that architecture decision-making is a key responsibility of an architect, and it is really a part of what defines you as an architect, and it's a way that you can demonstrate evidence of the value that you're adding on a daily basis. It's important for you to understand the criteria for determining what kinds of issues require decisions. Building a catalog of the commonly encountered types of decisions is a great way to harvest that knowledge and prime the pump. try to formulate, track, and record the decisions, and if you can integrate it with modeling tools, that would be a great, wonderful thing. And if our performance of architecture decision making is pretty immature, put together some sort of plan for improving your decision making over time. So we just wanted to, again, thank everybody for participating today. For that, we're offering a 25% discount on our web-based TOGAF 9 certification training. And again, there's a number of topics that we're considering for continuing forward with the rest of our topics in the webinar series, planning on doing, again, basically once a month for the rest of the year. So really want to thank everybody for their kind participation and interest. Again, here's a set of the detailed references if you want to dig in a little bit deeper. And if people are willing to hang around, unless you got to cut us off, Birgit, if people have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you all, and thank you, Chris.